Hello everyone, this is Daniel and welcome back to another video. Today I'll be showing you how to correctly export your characters from Blender to Unreal Engine 5. We'll be working with this very simple example so that we can really focus on all the technical details that really matter. So to summarize the main issues that are very common that we'll be covering in this video, I'll talk about correct FBX Export Settings. We'll cover the common issue of having leaf bones. Then we'll cover the even more common actually issue of having issues with your root joint scaling. Then I'll show you a few issues that you can run into with parenting and sort of the relationship between bones. And then we'll cover how to correctly export your bone orientations, because all of these things really matter and it's important to have control over them. So with that mentioned, let's dive right into it. So let me very quickly here create a new armature object, and if you're a Blender user, which you probably are if you're watching this video, this is how you would likely go about rigging this character, I believe. So I have turned on symmetry, and with Shift E I'm extruding these joints symmetrically. And so this is basically going to be our rig. So we'll go back to object mode. Here's one setting I like to have unchecked, lock object modes. That just makes it easier to switch between objects once we start to use pose mode. And speaking of pose mode, let's dive right into it, and I quickly want to rename a few things. So first, in the armature settings, we'll just call this object I don't know, rig or something. Apparently I've used this name already in this file, so let's just call it armature instead. It's the default name. And then we'll go to our bones, and I'll call these bones different names. So this is going to be our root bone, hip underscore L. This is going to be upper leg, left, lower leg, left foot, left, and now we'll just copy these names onto the other side. Make sure you replace the L with an R. Takes a few seconds, but it will make it a lot easier to follow what we're doing in this tutorial. And the hip will be the last one. So now that we have named all of our bones correctly, this is also very important. Quickly select your mesh and then your armature, hit Ctrl P, and we'll just parent this with automatic weights, so that now this is to some extent, bound together. It doesn't matter how rough this is for now. All we care about is really that these are now connected. So we'll now select both objects. You can go to object mode just to be sure. And with both of them selected, I'll go to export and export an FBX. Here, I'm just going to overwrite my existing file, just call it anything and save it to a location that you know of. And we'll now look at our export settings here. So I'm just going to restore the defaults because I had some settings here set already, and we'll now cover exactly which settings you want to change. First of all, I only want to export my selected objects. We won't be changing anything in the transform section for now. In the geometry tab, sometimes Unreal Engine gives you a little bit of some warnings related to normals. Usually if I change this to edge, all of that is solved, so I'm just going to switch that over. Then we'll go to armature and leave things for now as they are, although there are some things that we will want to look at a bit later. And I don't usually export my animations if I don't have any animations, so I'm just going to uncheck that. So let's export that and switch to Unreal Engine. In my root folder, I've created a new folder, call it tutorial, and I'm now just going to drag in the FBX file that we just created. Here I'm also going to reset to defaults and cover quickly the settings that I like to change. First of all, I don't want to create a physics asset just to keep things clean for now. I also don't want to generate any new materials so that we don't get distracted. We also don't need any textures. And with those couple of check marks changed, we're just going to import our mesh. Interestingly, we already get an error, and it tells us something about a joint called foot underscore L underscore N, but we never created a bone with this name, so it's kind of strange to see. So let's take a look at the skeleton And we'll quickly notice that in the hierarchy, which looks of course correct so far, there is a little joint at the very end which seemingly comes out of nowhere, and it doesn't really have any purpose, not even having any weight applied to it. So this is what's called a leaf bone or a leaf joint, which is generated by the Blender exporter, because Blender of course works with bones, and a bone has a start joint and an end joint. And so just because the exporter doesn't want to throw this information away for no reason, it generates here an additional joint, but if you don't need it, we of course don't have to export it. So let's delete our files here very quickly and switch back to Blender. And if we go back to our export settings, so export your FBX once again, and this time we will go to armature and uncheck add leaf bones. We export that again, go back to Unreal Engine, drag this file back in, the settings should be the same again, we'll just hit OK, and this time you'll see that these joints are gone and everything is as you would expect it. However, there's one big issue that many people struggle with, and that is that the root joint for some reason has this scaling of 100 applied to it. And you know, playing around with the settings, it takes quite some time to figure out the correct way of dealing with it. So let me just walk you through that right now. The thing that you need to do is in the unit settings of your scene. So go to your scene settings here, go to units and change the unit scale to 0.01. Now if you do that, if you change anything about this number, your whole scene will change. And your character is now, if you go to item here, very, very tiny. So we'll now select both objects, hit S to scale, and scale it by 100. Now the character is back to the correct size, but yeah, as you can see, we can't really look at it properly. So we'll go to View and change our view clipping. I'll set this to 0.1 and this to 100, which is roughly the default values, I believe. And now we can see our character and the whole scene again, and that's all good. But now we still have a scale applied to our character. In fact, the scale isn't even on the object, but it is here on the armature for now. So let's try to select the armature first and hit Ctrl A and apply the scale. But now the scale will be applied on the geometry, which is a little bit of a trap. That's why I applied it only on the armature first. So you don't want the scale to be on this either, so I'm just going to select the mesh as well and hit Ctrl A and apply the scale. So both objects should now have no scale on them in object mode. And with this changed, I'll now go back and export my FBX file and just overwrite our existing file here. So back in Unreal Engine 5, let's just to be sure, let's delete our files and drag it back in. We'll import it with the same settings, and this should have solved our issue. And as you can see, our root joint has now a scale of 1 and everything is good. So let's go back to Blender and quickly bring up our annotations again, just to remind ourselves of what the next issue was, and of course we won't be able to see them again because they're very tiny here in the middle. So here we have them. I had to zoom in quite a bit, but we already looked at the correct FBX settings. We then looked at the leaf bones, we looked at the root bone scaling, and now we'll look at correct parenting and bone orientations. So what do I mean by parenting issues? Let's go back to Unreal Engine and I'll show you what I mean. Basically, in Blender, this here is one joint, but if you look very carefully, in Unreal Engine 5, this has turned into 2 joints, and that is not something that we want. It just behaves differently in a way. And that's again a conversion issue. It has something to do with the way how Blender works with bones instead of joints. So you have to imagine if this was one joint and these joints are parented to it. If I was to rotate this joint, both of these are supposed to follow along. So this one is also supposed to, you know, go down like that. But in Blender, we're working with bones. So that means that I can select either one of them and rotate them. And that's the behavior that is expected. But as you can see, once we convert between the two systems, things start to break. So what do we need to change to make Unreal Engine's result look like this? So it's a bit complicated, but this is what you want to do. First of all, we'll delete these two bones. Then I will extrude this center bone like so, and I'll select these two upper legs first, then this new bone here, and we will hit Ctrl P and parent this, but keep the offset. So now the result is one bone here and these two on the side parented to it. This bone will now receive the name hip, and we don't need L and R anymore because this is not on both sides. Now all we do is we export that once again. Just overwrite your file, and because the structure is changing now, we'll just delete these assets and drag it back in. And now you'll see that even though we kind of extruded this to the top, we don't actually see this. This is because the end of this bone is a leaf joint, and that is removed. But these two bones are parented to this joint in the middle. And that basically leaves us with what we want, which is a hip joint here, which affects both of the legs. And then we have just, you know, the legs on both sides. So this is again something tricky, which can be very annoying, but you will have to get used to that because Blender works differently to Unreal Engine. So that is basically all I wanted to say about the parenting issue. Just be sure you know that. Of course you won't have any issues if they're in a chain, but in these places where they split like so, you'll have to keep that in mind. And then there is the last topic that I want to talk about with it, which is controlling the joint orientation. And that can be very important because you have lots of features in game development that really rely on correct joint orientation. Things like retargeting, you know, transferring animations from one rig to another, these sort of things. It matters a lot. And we have to look at sort of an example of what is correct orientation first. So I'm just going to the files that are included with Unreal Engine in the third-person example. We'll go to characters, the mannequin that's provided by Epic Games, and in the meshes you have, of course, the mannequin. And this is the new one, and we'll just zoom in and look a little bit at the joints. You'll see that each joint has its own orientations. You can see the little the axes here color-coded correctly, and if we select one of these and we go to scaling, make sure that you're in well, you only can be in object mode, I believe, you get this also a bit easier, more visible here. So one thing that you'll notice here very quickly is that here the x-axis is pointing upwards, while here on the other side it's pointing downwards. And you know, all the other directions have also a very certain direction, and there is no correct and wrong. It's just that in Unreal Engine this mannequin rig is sort of the standard that most developers try to follow. So if you're looking at sort of the best way of doing it, I would recommend you just follow exactly the correct orientations from this rig. So we'll be looking at how we can recreate the orientations from this rig in our rig now. Let's go back to Blender and look at our orientations. So what you can do is go to the display settings here in the armature object, and in the viewport display tab we can check axes, and that will show which direction everything's facing. But now you run into an issue because you can't really turn this. If you rotate it in pose mode, of course that is not what you want to do. You go to edit mode and you'll notice that you can't turn it. The only way to turn it is by moving the child, and there is just no way of doing that. So what do you do? This is again a little bit of a tricky one, but the slightly inconvenient and only answer that there is to this at the moment is you select all of your bones, you hit Alt P and clear the parent by disconnecting the bones. This will still leave them parented, So if we go to pose mode, they're still connected, but they don't share the same joint anymore. This allows us to, for example, scale this down to here, and we can change all the other parts as well. And so with that now changed, we can now begin to rotate them as we wish. And the easiest way of doing that is actually to, first of all, disable your symmetry tools. Then I'll go here onto this and change the pivot point to individual origins. That allows us to rotate it around the the base, which makes it so that we never modify the position of it, which only modifies the orientation of the joint. And just to give you an example, I'll rotate this over by 90 degrees. And we'll just export this as is. So export this as an FBX over our current file and go back to Unreal Engine. We'll be needing that again later, but for now let's go back to our scene. Let's delete our files and re-import everything. And now you'll notice something a little bit strange, because even though we rotated it and look at how strange this is looking at this point, yet our chain is still straight. And that is because we're not exporting the leaf bones. Instead, it's just going to give us the parented chain. However, this time our rotations will have changed. And the x-axis, the red one, just like expected, is pointing upwards. Let's go back here. X is pointing upwards. Then let's look at Z. Z is pointing forwards, and here Z is pointing forwards. However, you'll notice that the y-axis is always pointing in the wrong direction. And that is okay. So this is something you will have to ignore, because Unreal Engine is based on all the DirectX technologies, which means that it has a coordinate system that it's a bit hard to explain, but it is a different coordinate system, and the y-axis is always pointing in the opposite direction from all the applications that use the OpenGL standard, and Blender uses the OpenGL standard. So you just have to imagine that the y-axis is on the opposite from what you see in Blender, but it's correct that way. So now that we're able to control the orientation, the last thing that we want to do is to basically look at what we want. So let's go back to the mannequin here. I mean, I know it already, but just to show you, we want the x-axis to point upwards on this side and down on this side, and the z to point to, the right of the character in both cases. So let's quickly try to recreate that. Here we have already x pointing upwards, and y is pointing to this side, it seems. So that's already wrong. We'll go to edit mode, select, let's just select everything for now. We will turn it so that z is pointing into this direction. So this side is correct. On the other side, we need to turn x around. So we can go on this side, turn this around by 180 degrees, and we forgot this little joint at the bottom. You don't necessarily need to keep them that small anyway. You can just make them large so that they're easy to see. That is not really something that matters. Finally though, you'll see that for some reason this one ended up kind of pointing in a different direction. Or no, sorry, actually this is the one that's pointing in the wrong direction. And that's because the role has changed. If we go to item here, you can change the role of this. And it seems like we'll have to set this to 90. And that makes it so that the orientation is correct again. For the hip joint, I actually don't quite remember what the correct orientation was, so let's go and take a look here. And here x is pointing upwards, so let's recreate that quickly. We want x to point upwards, and the role has changed here, so we'll set that to the correct value of -90 in this case. And for the root bone, you usually want to align it with the coordinate system. So if we look at it here, it's aligned with this coordinate system. X should be pointing towards the left side and Z up. So back in Blender, you'd probably want the roll to be 0, and this will just rotate by a lot. That changed the roll again. Can be a bit frustrating, but there we go. Just make sure Y is pointing into the wrong direction, basically. Anyway, but that is now the correct rig. You can now select all of your objects, export them as your FBX, just overwrite your file. We'll go into here. We can also just simply re-import this. Right click on it. I'll just close this in case I don't want any crash now. Re-import this file, and if you go onto your skeletal assets right now, you'll see that they should now all have the correct orientation, with X pointing upwards here, downwards here, and all the other things being correct as well. So that is how you control orientations. So yeah, I think that if you have tried any of these things before in Blender and exporting to Unreal Engine, you'll have come across all of these issues. But it's good to see that regardless of all the different obstacles, it's still possible. Of course, I wish that the flow was improved a little bit, and so that it wasn't so difficult to get it all right. But here you go, that's how you set it up. Finally, one little advice that I want to give you, or it's more of a little idea that I want to share. It's of course not very practical to have a rig like this in Blender and animating with it and doing all the other things. So what I would suggest you to do is to have this as a second rig. You'll have your first rig, which is your typical I'm not going to create it now, but let's just copy this over here for demonstration. But let's say this is your normal rig, which is done the normal Blender way, so not like this now, it's just straight and connected directly. But then you have this as a second armature, and you just add lots of constraints onto it. We'll have to go to pose mode for that. You have your bone constraints here, and you could do some parenting stuff, copy location, copy rotation, all these other things to copy the transformation of the typical Blender rig onto the export rig. And that just makes it so that you can separate sort of the complexity a little bit, so that you can keep the Blender rig as it was in Blender and then just export with the special sort of modified orientations. But all in all, you will have to create a rig that looks sort of like this to export correctly to Unreal Engine. So just keep that in mind. Let's just go back to Unreal Engine one more time, and that will give you a result like this. So I hope you learned something from this video. It's not easy to find this information, so if you liked it, make sure that you share it with anyone who could find this useful. And of course, I would always appreciate a like and a subscription. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.